And within another 2 years, we expect it to be essentially finished, and they will be importing all of their wheat. Now that's 3 million tons out of the 6 million ton global harvest, so it's about half of 1%. That's not going to rock world grain markets. But the other food bubbles, incidentally, the same thing is happening in Yemen. Yemen will be one of the first countries to literally run out of water, and it doesn't have the financial resources that the Saudis do to desalt water or to import grain on the same scale. So they're going to be in trouble. Yemen is a failing state, and this could be the coup de grace, if you will, that will lead to its breakdown. So we're looking at a number of countries with food bubbles, including the big three grain producers, China, India, and the United States. And the unfortunate reality is that these bubbles, which have been building over the last few decades, are going to be bursting at about the same time. And again, I don't think they were prepared for some of these drops in food production. Ice melting. We really don't have to go beyond ice melting to see that the world's in trouble on the food front. The two vulnerable ice sheets are the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. The West Antarctic ice sheet, as you know, has been slowly breaking up for at least 15 years now. The Greenland ice sheet is melting, and it's melting at an accelerating rate. If the Greenland ice sheet were to go entirely, sea level would rise 23 feet. The current projections, 23 feet is quite a bit. The current projections have sea level rising during this century by up to 6 feet. The World Bank, and that's a combination of Greenland, of West Antarctica, melting in the early stages, and expanding ocean because of rising temperatures, thermal expansion. But even a 1 meter rise in sea level, according to a World Bank map, would inundate half of the rice land in Bangladesh, a country of 170 million people. A 1 meter rise would put much of the Mekong Delta underwater. The Mekong Delta produces half the rice in Vietnam. And Vietnam is the world's #2 rice exporter after Thailand. There are another, we calculate, and we count 19 rice-growing river deltas in Asia that would be affected in varying degrees by a 1 meter rise in sea level. What this underlines is the growing complexity of the world in which we live, and the new links that are developing between the environment and the economy. I mean, the idea that ice melting on an island, a large island in the far North Atlantic, could shrink the rice harvest of Asia, where half the world's people live, is not intuitively obvious. This is not part of our thinking. When we get reports on the Greenland ice sheet, those scientific reports don't talk about how it's going to affect the rice harvest in Vietnam, for example. The other ice melting that's of great concern is melting mountain glaciers. The World Glacier Monitoring Service, located in Switzerland, has just reported the 19th consecutive year of shrinking mountain glaciers around the world. And they monitor a number of glaciers in the major mountain ranges like the Andes and the Rockies, the Alps, the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau. If you have any friends who are skeptical about global warming, you might want to suggest they visit Glacier National Park in northern Montana in the Rocky Mountains, very close to the Canadian border. When Glacier National Park was established a century or so ago, there were 150 glaciers there. At the end of last year, there were 27 glaciers. In April, the park management reported that 2 more glaciers had disappeared. There are now 25. They expect they will all be gone by 2020. So if your friends want to see why Glacier National Park is called Glacier National Park, they should plan to visit sooner rather than later. But the melting of those glaciers will affect the tourist industry in Montana. But the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas on the Tibetan Plateau is what conserves food analysts. Because it is the ice melt from those glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau that sustains the major rivers of Asia during the dry season. The Indus, the Ganges, the Mekong, the Yangtze, the Yellow River. That ice melt during the dry season also sustains the irrigation systems dependent on those rivers. In India, most of the irrigation comes from pumping underground water. In China, most of the irrigation comes from surface irrigation systems from the rivers. We forget that China is the world's #1 wheat producer. India is #2. The U.S. is #3. Because we export so much wheat, people sort of think we must be the biggest, but we're not. China's wheat harvest is nearly double ours. The area in wheat is very similar. But because most of China's wheat harvest is irrigated, the yields are roughly double those that we get with dryland wheat farming in the Great Plains. So what happens to those rivers is of concern not only to people who live in China and India. And I neglected to mention that with rice, China and India totally dominate the world rice harvest. So what happens to those glaciers and those river flows is of concern to everyone. I mean, I think it's tempting as Americans to say, oh, well, those glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau, they're China's problem. They are China's problem, but they're also our problem. Because if China comes into the world market for massive quantities of grain, as it already has for soybeans, it will come to the United States. What we're looking at is, as consumers, is the likelihood that we will be competing with 1.3 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes for our grain harvest. Historically, as in the 70s when something like that happened, we restricted grain exports. But we can't do that with China. China is our banker. Every month, the Treasury Department, not too many blocks from here, auctions off Treasury securities to cover our fiscal deficit. And one of the big buyers is China. They're now holding nearly $1 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury securities. Like it or not, we're going to be sharing our grain harvest with the Chinese. Again, the idea that glaciers melting on the Tibetan Plateau could affect food prices at supermarket checkout counters in the United States is not intuitively obvious. But it is a reality. Those links are real. These are some of the reasons why I think food is going to be the weak link in our civilization as well. We have seen in 2007, 2008, we saw world grain prices triple. The biggest jump in history. It wasn't because of a weather failure. It was primarily because of all there were a number of factors involved, but the primary cause was the huge number of ethanol distilleries coming online in the United States. We have also seen in recent years a reversal of the long-term trend of the decline in the number of hungry people in the world. That bottomed out around the turn of the century at something like 325 million, and by the end of 2008 it was up to 2007 up to 900 million, and then 2008 up to 1 billion. And most of the projections show rising food prices into the future, so that number is likely to increase. The disturbing thing about this is exactly what happened to the Sumerians. The number of hungry people started increasing. That's what happened to the Mayans. And yet, we know this trend exists, but there is no major response to it. So the economic indicator to watch is grain prices. The social indicator to watch is the number of hungry people in the world. The political indicator to watch is the number of failing states in the world. For me, this is sort of the bottom line indicator. And what we're seeing is that as stresses build on governments, whether it's water shortages or lack of access to oil, or rising food prices, or rising unemployment, these stresses are becoming unmanageable for the weaker governments. They're beginning to break down. They're losing their credibility. People expect their governments to provide personal security, food security, adequate supplies of water, social services like education and healthcare. And when governments can't supply those, they begin to lose their credibility. And people look for alternative sources of leadership. And these countries don't often sort of go quietly into the night. They can become real problems. Afghanistan is a source of about 92% of the heroin in the world today. Somalia. I was on a book tour in Minneapolis back in November. Sunday afternoon, I wanted to visit some friends. I needed a cab to get from the hotel where I was staying. The Minnesota Vikings were playing the Green Bay Packers, and Brett Favre, who had been the Packer quarterback, had come out of retirement and quarterbacked the Vikings, so there was a lot of interest in this game. And the only cab drivers on the street were Somalis. So I had a chance to talk with them. And as I was being escorted around the city by them, their cousins were escorting ships around the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean into port in Somalia to be held for ransom. And I talked to them about it. And I mean, some of them knew people who were in that business. But it's created a real headache for the industrial world, because all the oil from the Middle East comes through that area. I mean, the Somalis, some months back, were holding a tanker of 2 million barrels of oil worth 2 million barrels of oil, $150 million. They were trying to decide what percentage of that they wanted to charge for the ransom. I think they ended up with $7.5 million. There's 17 countries now that have parts of their navies in the Arabian Sea, near the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the mouth, the southern end of the Suez Canal, trying to, and not very successfully, trying to protect the ships moving through that area. So those are the kinds of problems that come with failing states, or they become training grounds for Al-Qaeda, for example, as Yemen is now becoming, as Pakistan and Afghanistan have been in the past. The number of failing states in the world is growing longer now, year by year.